of kind of linking this back into what we were talking about with the biological anthropology material and some of the early dispersal routes from Africa of Homo erectus populations, and what are called archaic Homo sapiens. So in this map, you can see, as I said, most of the cool stuff in evolution happens within Africa. The first dispersals, expansions out of Africa are of Homo erectus populations, which make it pretty far all across Eurasia, basically. And it's speculated that, these sort of cousins, the Neanderthals, are pretty well documented. The Denisovans are more genetically documented than archaeologically documented, but they seem to be kind of cousin-related Homo populations. We're not, there's your favorite, the Homo floresiensis, who somehow got onto this island across the biogeographic boundary and stayed there. That's still kind of a mystery, and there's no evidence that Homo floresiensis admixtured in with the Homo sapien populations as they came through. They seem to have been there and gone. But there is evidence, again, of Neanderthal admixture, that is, some interbreeding, and with the Denisovans, and that those populations did shape the genetic code as people expanded into these areas. But eventually the Homo sapiens, oh, by the way, this happens at about 65,000 years ago, about, pretty amazing, kind of, that the Homo sapiens were into Australia. But what we see here is these so-called archaics, or the Neanderthals, or other bipedal species eventually disappear at least about 35,000 years ago, leaving only Homo sapiens throughout this pretty incredible geographic range. And I was looking at the map. This was a research article that was published in 2018 that talks about what separates the Homo sapiens from the other bipedals, the other hominins. The argument is that it wasn't some sort of symbolic switch or language that suddenly turned on in their brains, but the unique position as a global general specialist, which is to say, and this is a hypothesis, just to say that the Homo sapiens seem to be uniquely flexible, or plasticity, and that we can adapt to a number of different environments, very different environments. So there are species that adapt, or there are species that are sort of specialist in certain environments, so they get very adapted to one environment. And there are other species that are generalists. They can live almost anywhere, but they don't really adapt to that environment. They're just able to live there. And Homo sapiens are not only able to live in these different environments, we adapt culturally, and in some ways, because culture has feedback loops on our biology, and how we eat affects how we develop and all those things, we can go from being like heavy duty meat eaters to very almost exclusively vegetarians, and different kinds of things in different environments. And so this is, I think it pretty much squares with what Muckle, González, and Camp end the last chapter with, and we talked a little bit about, is that there's this expansion of territories. So you have the emergence of Homo sapiens in Africa at about 300,000 years ago, as we talked about, some going into Australia as of 65,000 years ago, in what is now the Middle East as about 100,000 years ago, Siberia at 60,000, and in Europe at about 40,000 years ago. So, but what enables the Homo sapiens to expand their range in this way and enables them to out-compete or live in a larger range of environments than the other bipedals is that they don't depend on biology for survival. They're adapting culturally to these environments using a package of hunting, gathering, fire, and tool making in order to do this adaptation. Now, I talked about this before, but it's extremely important as we think about the expansion of Homo sapiens. They are always going to be connected to each other, trading with each other, borrowing from each other, and having a system of what is called exogamous marriages, where you have to, you have to marry outside of your closest group. So not everyone is going to be marrying someone from far away, but you have to marry. You spread out your social ties by making marriages, or even as we saw among the non-human primates, certain females or males would leave their natal group in order to marry into, well, they don't marry, in order to mate with the people, the non-human primates in another group. So humans have always been trading around. And so this means that the membership of these kin groups, these bands would, kinship, being related to somebody, being family, would be important, but it wasn't the completely defining feature. It's not like these groups became isolated from each other in any sort of genetic or biological sense. And we talked about this, that when it comes to the idea of race, it isn't that there were groups that became isolated and developed completely separate racial characteristics. Obviously, the biological stuff began to vary across this range, in part because the adaptation to different environments, in part because of genetic drift, just people who tended to end up in different places, but people were always interconnected, and they were always part of one interbreeding species. And so, for example, the people who were in Australia did in some ways become isolated from the other continents for 50, 60,000 years. Now, again, Australia is a huge place, and people were interconnected across Australia. And as soon as they came back together, were colonized, people began interbreeding again, and there were no species membership issues with the interbreeding. So people have always been interconnected. Homo sapiens have been one interbreeding species across this range. Now, it has been something of a puzzle or a mystery as to how Homo sapiens, people, came into the Americas. Now, I would say that this is a puzzle for the Europeans when they sailed westward and stumbled upon the Americas and found people there. It was not a puzzle for the people who were living in the Americas. They were fine. They knew what was going on. They knew where they were. But it's been something of a puzzle for people studying human dispersals, is how did it happen that people came into the Americas? When and where did this occur? And I want to, before we get into that, talk about the things that the issues of the puzzle and what people called other people. Of course, we have Columbus showing up, not knowing where he was, thinking and hoping that he had made it to Asia, and imagining that he was somewhere off the coast of India. And so that is how we get the name Indians. He was lost. Unfortunately, hopefully everybody knows that that's not the best, but some times that name has stuck in archaeology, even with Muckle, González and Camp. I was kind of sad to see they used something that showed up in my kids' elementary school textbook, the name Paleo Indians, which refers to people, or refers to a period here in North America from 14,000 to 9,000 years ago. And I'm not, this makes me, paleo, of course, means, as we saw, means ancient or old. And so one might get the impression that people are the old Indians. Not the best. After that, in my son's elementary school textbook, they said, these were the first Americans, the first Americans. Well, what's the problem with saying that the people here were the first Americans? Yes. Huh? We just got, it's a source that the people who are here would have thought, I mean, the name America, of course, comes to us from Amerigo Vespucci, who was after Columbus. In fact, Columbus had already died before the name America was used for the continents of the Americas. And so to call people the first Americans, and I guess, and especially in the context of the elementary school textbook, I just had this image of people sort of coming across the ice bridge and waving an American flag because, here they are, the first, they have this sort of patriotic bent. And, I mean, I think Native Americans is better than that, but it does still incorporate that American phrase. And, I mean, we're getting better. Native Americans, go with that. Especially in Canada, some groups have said that they call themselves First Nations, which is an interesting idea, the kind of idea that the people from there were organized, and not only there, but were organized in a kind of politically as well. Some people are a little bit reluctant to say nations because it implies that there's kind of a nation state formation going on before or equivalent to, and there were certainly some groups that were organized in things that we might call nations or states, but I'm not sure that makes it sort of imposes, again, our own frame of reference onto political systems that were perhaps more interesting than being nations and governed in ways that we want. First Peoples, I think, is another way that people talk about it, and basically, I think more and more, I think being Indigenous capitalized I or Native capitalized N is a preferred term for people who, for many people, or from group membership, if people belong to a particular Native or Indigenous group, it's fine to say that too. So just, the terminology, be careful here. Now, why is this an issue? One of the issues is that a lot of the people who were named by or the names that we've received came from European explorers. A lot of them were wrong or mislabeled. And so some of the things that, or many of the things that happened with the treatment of Indigenous Americans or people Indigenous in America is some of the really the worst things in the history of the world in terms of the way people were treated, and also treated by so-called scientists who would be digging up their graves or extracting artifacts or trying to figure out, from their bones, taking things without permission. And this goes into the present, where people have been trying to get Indigenous people's DNA, to extract it and to figure out various things, both to try and claim that people are not Native American, or some people trying to claim that they are, and so that they are entitled to things. So this relates to a general issue both in DNA research and in anthropology, is when you are working with people, try to study with them, not just be the study of them. And so I think that Jennifer Raff's book, A Genetic History of the Americas, is one of the few people who actually took this stuff seriously, and as a result was able to do better science because was attentive to some of these issues about naming and origins, and that science is not the only answer for why people have about how they got to the place they are, and we should be respectful of that. Because there's been a lot of suspicions about the DNA research and the kind of extractive material that people have tried to get from these groups. So, you know, I like Raff's work a lot because, you know, in comparison to others, has been attentive to those issues. So, dispersal of first people into the Americas. What do we find out, Alex, that we never knew about before? Beringia, yeah. So we have Siberia, people up in the people up in Siberia, and then camping out for a decent amount of time in Beringia, and there are still parts of Beringia. It still exists as a land area, but it had a very different climate and was probably larger than what remains today. And the genetic evidence is supporting something that was hypothesized, which is that how did people get basically from here pretty quickly all the way down throughout South America? How did that happen if it was a land route or an ice bridge? Basically, the coastal route, the idea that people came down the coast and you could travel faster, seems to be getting more support from the genetic evidence that they could have then come across this side of the coast as well at the Isthmus of Panama. A lot of the archaeological evidence for this, for these routes, has basically been submerged and destroyed. So it's still in some ways a non-falsifiable hypothesis, in the sense that there's not a ton of archaeological evidence for it, but it seems to best fit the dispersal route for what's going on. For me, I think it's just important to understand what this is, what is not true, or what is not true that has been not hypothesized, but speculated. People did not get here from outer space. There was nobody visiting to give people pyramids or something like that. There's no aliens. They weren't Europeans, so they weren't coming here from Europe. And they weren't Egyptians, and they were not the lost tribes of Israel. Again, these things may seem fantastical, especially the aliens part, but honestly, all of these things have been raised as, oh, it must be this, it must be that. So, Siberia to Beringia and through. The other thing that seems to be true is that this, and this is perhaps more serious, is this happened before what is called the Clovis First Hypothesis, which is named for a site in New Mexico, Clovis, New Mexico, where they found the Clovis hunting, some pretty cool hunting artifacts. And so it was thought that they were big game hunters chasing mammals over the ice and following the mammals down and shooting the mammals with their bows and arrows. It seems like the Clovis technologies, hunting technologies, were actually developed in the Americas by people who were already here. And so this happened before there was the idea that that was the technology that enabled people to come into the Americas. It seems to have happened before that. And it seems that the coastal routes are at least as important, if not more important, than the land routes. And so it's coming down the coast and then spreading, in this case, eastward via land. Now, I don't think we should necessarily rule out different land routes. Obviously, land is very important and people probably migrated that way too, but the evidence seems to be shifting more toward the coastal route. To the extent that there's a land route, there is evidence for that as well, but it seems like we're getting more evidence for a primarily coastal dispersal, and then of course moving it through land, so that all of the Americas are pretty well populated by 14 to 15,000 years ago, which is kind of incredible too. Now, this matches up pretty well with what Muckle, González, and Camp tell us about North America, with one exception, which is their map. And in the last class, I told you that I was so happy that they included my suggestion of, not following the binary, ancient gender binary. But in this case, they ignored my suggestion and put on here routes A, B, and C. The coastal migration route, which we just knew about, the ice-free corridor route, which is also possible and probable. But then they put on the map the North Atlantic route. But if you read in the book their own words, this North Atlantic route is called the Solatrian Hypothesis. And they say on page 140, although this hypothesis remains popular and is supported by some archaeologists, most believe there is not enough evidence to support it. And I would say that this is like 99% believe there's not evidence to support that some people were coming in from Western Europe across the ice in the North Atlantic. I don't like it. And I don't like it being on the map, especially if, as it says, most. So I wanted them to take that out. So if you have your book, just kind of X that out. They didn't do that. I don't think so. And I also don't like it because who likes this idea? Why is this idea popular? Popular. Yeah. Yeah, it gets support in all the wrong circles. I'll just say it's popular amongst all the people that I don't like, and they're like, oh yes, well, look at these stone tools that they had. They're just like the ones. And it's like, well, there's only so many ways to make a spear point, as it turns out. You can find the same looking stone tools in Africa and other places as well. So anyway, don't go with that one. The evidence, and here they do say that there's cultural, linguistic, technology, biological, and DNA evidence. The evidence of initial entry via Beringia is much stronger. Darn right. This evidence includes cultural similarities of people of Northeast Asia as reflected in technology, and biological similarities, including DNA. So, of course, we never want to completely rule out ideas, and sure, maybe there's somebody made it across and somehow something, but for the most part, we can be pretty confident that this is the scenario for the populating of the Americas. So we are starting this chapter about what happened from 20,000 to 5,000 years ago. And this is a pretty big, obviously it's pretty big that Homo sapiens go out all over the world, but as Muckle, González, and Camp put it, there's some pretty large processes that continue, such as these human expansions, the expansion into the Americas. So that was already happening, the Homo sapien expansion. But there's some other things that began during this period, such as the domestication of plants and animals and new forms of human settlement around the world. So we'll be looking at that later. So, but what we have here at about 20,000, about, let's say 15,000 years ago, we have all these populations that are dependent upon gathering and upon hunting and mixes of those all across the world. Now, some people have gotten excited about this and think that there's one diet which we all should be on, which is the paleo diet, the ancient diet. But as much as we should maybe be looking at our food and thinking about how we can avoid eating super processed foods like Twinkies, that doesn't mean that there was one diet or some sort of natural diet for human beings, that everybody ate the same thing and that you can look it up in a well, it's not even a cookbook, because most of the paleo people just want you to pull something out of the ground or eat something off a tree and don't even cook it. And the thing is that cooking and harvesting wild grains and even making bread, which paleos don't like at all, actually predates agriculture. You don't need to be growing those wild grains in order to cook them, process them, and make them into bread. That happened before they were cultivating those. So I don't want to be too down. Like I said, if it helps us to get away from some of the super processed, sugary, industrial foods, then fine. But don't think that that's some sort of one natural human diet that existed. There's all kinds of things, and cooking has long been a part of that. So there were lots of different ways of hunting and gathering, lots of different ways of interacting with the environment. But what we'll be looking at starting in the next class is how people began to experiment with and open up new pathways of interaction with plants and animals, which led in certain areas to a dependence on those plants and animals. That is to say that people started to rely on these, and that helped bring about some pretty important social transformations in how many people were able to live in a certain area and how they were able to organize themselves and group themselves together. But that's what we'll be studying over the next 2 or 3 classes as we work through this chapter on the development of plant and animal domestication. We better stop there because it's like a party going on next door. So that's all we can do for today before the music gets too loud. We can party with the FLPers over there.